A strange alien race called the Formics invades the Earth, forcing soldiers from the international military to fight back. Unfortunately, the aliens are too strong for them, and as a commander named Mazer watches his men dying, he decides to do something about it. Suddenly, Mazer decides to fly his plane into the alien ship to blow it up. Years later, the international military is now training kids to prepare them for another potential invasion of the Formics. Since Mazer's sacrifice didn't entirely take them out, the leaders of the international military believe they must be prepared in case of another invasion. Among the kids in the program is a boy named Ender, who is being monitored by a colonel named Graf and a major named Gwen. As he's playing a game with a classmate,
International fleet decided that the world's smartest...
Graf keeps telling Gwen that he believes Ender is the special kid who will lead an army against the Formics. Even though Gwen agrees that he's quite smart, she says she's unsure about Graf's insistence on Ender being the chosen one. After Ender wins his game, his opponent gets really angry and asks for a rematch.
Come on!
But he says they can play later. Graf seems impressed by this, but Gwen says he might be acting because he knows he's being monitored. As the two officers continue to talk about Ender, they finally decide to see how the boy will handle rejection. Following this, Ender hears his name on the public address system,
Andrew Wiggin,
with instructions for him to go to the infirmary. When Ender gets there, a doctor comes in and says she's there to remove the monitor at the back of his head. Ender asks if it means he's off the program, but the doctor says she can't answer the question. After the procedure, Ender looks sad because he has now been asked to go home. On his way to the lobby, his pained classmate teams up with his friends to bully Ender, who says he doesn't want to fight. However, when the ringleader insists, Ender manages to beat him to the ground, after which he repeatedly kicks him. Graf watches this as it happens, and he looks really impressed. Shortly after, Ender arrives home and complains to his sister Valentine about how he couldn't control himself in school. Valentine tries to convince him that he's not at fault, but Ender says he thinks he's now behaving like their brother, Peter, who is quite rash and violent. Just as Valentine tells him not to think like that, Peter shows up and asks what's happening. Ender then mentions that he's now off the program, like his siblings, who used to be young cadets in the international military. Peter makes fun of Ender for failing, but Valentine stops him.
That's it. Where's Mom?
However, he eventually locks her out and asks Ender to play a game with him. Ender agrees, but as the game starts, Peter gets really violent and starts choking his brother. Valentine shouts for him to stop, but before he does, Peter tells Ender that he should have been the one their parents sent for another trial in the program. Later that night, during dinner,
faced during the first invasion.
The silence at the table gets awkward, and Ender finally says he can leave if his parents feel embarrassed. However, his mom says she's not embarrassed. His dad also says that Ender doesn't have to worry about his rejection because he also failed as a young cadet. Just then, Graf and Gwen arrive at their house, requesting to speak to Ender. The family looks shocked, but as they let them in, Graf asks Ender why he kept kicking his classmate even after he was down. Ender then mentions that he did it to stop his colleague from ever bullying him again.
So they'd leave me alone.
Graf sounds impressed and says he liked how Ender's strategy was tactical. Graf then invites Ender back into the military, saying he has passed the final evaluation. Even though his parents are not in support, Graf takes Ender outside and narrates how he believes the young boy is a future commander who will help destroy the Formics. He also tells Ender that he's graduated from the program and will be taken to the battle school in a different location. Following this, Ender says goodbye to his family, after which he's taken to a spaceship where he sees other young cadets headed to the battle school. He appears to be late, and a boy named Bean immediately tells him. Ender then mentions that it was out of his control. He also introduces himself to Bean, and they seem to get along well. Shortly after, Graf comes in to speak to the kids about their trip to the battle school. While he's talking, Ender says something really smart, and Graf singles him out as the smartest kid on the ship. Ender doesn't like this because Graf will make the others hate him, and as they arrive at the battle school, he explains this to the colonel. However, Graf says he shouldn't be bothered by whether the others like him or not, as it's what will determine if he can be a good commander. When Ender enters the room for the cadets, a boy named Bernard jokingly calls him the smartest. However, Ender doesn't respond to this, but he looks happy to have gotten a bed near the entrance. While he's then looking at the items assigned to him, a sergeant named Dap comes in to instruct the kids on how they must behave in the school. The next day, all the new cadets are taken to the battle room to gain experience in moving well under low gravity. While they're at it, Ender meets Bean again, and together they test what it feels like to get shot in their suits.
Whoa!
After they discover that their bodies will get frozen, Graf calls back all the kids to leave the battle room. Days later, Ender and the other kids continue their training. He also sends several messages to Valentine, but she doesn't respond to any of them. The next day, while Graf is speaking to the new cadets to inform them that they could get promoted to higher-ranked teams, Ender asks if communications to their families are being jammed. Graf confirms this, but Ender doesn't understand the decision. The colonel then mentions that their families don't need to hear about the things happening in the battle school. The next day in class, Ender defends a boy named Alai as Bernard tries to insult him. This makes his mates see him differently, and during lunch, they sit next to him instead of Bernard. Later that night, while Ender is playing with his monitor, he gets access to a game created by Gwen to help monitor how he deals with frustrating situations. Even though Graf is not in support, because he's more concerned about training Ender to become a leader, he still watches. In the game, a monster tells Ender to choose an option between two cups, with one already being poisoned.
One is poison, one is not.
Despite taking turns with both cups, he still fails, and Alai eventually sits with him while he plays. Just then, Ender uses his mouse character to attack one of the monster's eyes. Gwen looks shocked and says that no one has ever tried to get past the monster like that. However, Graf says it's another reason to believe that Ender will be a perfect commander. That night, Ender gets a message to inform him that he's being promoted to an army led by a soldier named Bonzo. As he's leaving, Alai wishes him good luck, and Ender thanks his new friend. After a while, Ender reaches Bonzo's army base and meets the soldiers playing baseball. He then introduces himself to a girl named Petra, who realizes that Ender is the replacement for their colleague who was sent back to Earth.
So you're the replacement?
Meanwhile, when Bonzo sees Ender, he doesn't look satisfied, as he believes the young cadet is not good enough. He also mentions that his team is currently on an unbeaten training battle streak, which he'll not allow Ender to ruin for him. Petra tries to get Bonzo to take it easy on Ender, but the commander tells her to stay out of it. Just then, he tells Ender that when it's time for the next battle, he has to stay back.
You bunk at the back of the room.
Later that night, though, Petra tells Ender that Bonzo is like that because he doesn't like losing. She also says she'd happily teach him a few moves when he's ready. Ender happily accepts her offer, and the next day, she takes him to the battle room to teach him some valuable tips to use during a battle.
Now you're getting it.
When they return to their room, Bonzo sees them and tells Ender to stop training. However, Ender eventually convinces Bonzo to change his mind, even though it almost leads to a fight. The next day, Bonzo then tells Ender to come along with his team for a battle with the soldiers of the Leopard team. However, he mentions that Ender will stay at the gates to watch during the battle, though. Bonzo's team is on course for their first defeat, and Petra also gets hit. As he sees this, Ender decides to enter the battle room to help. Petra looks shocked to see him because Bonzo won't be pleased, but Ender says he just wants to help. Following this, he tells Petra he has a plan, and with her help, he helps Bonzo's team win. After the battle, the leader of the Leopard team commends Ender for saving Bonzo's team. However, Bonzo is not too happy about this. Later on, while Petra and Ender are training, Bonzo shows up and punches the new boy while telling him never to go against his instructions. That night, Ender can't sleep, so he decides to play his game again. As he enters the game, he sees a strange creature that suddenly transforms into Valentine. Ender then follows her as she enters a cave. While he's then staring at her, a snake shows up and attacks him. As he tries to kill the snake, Ender suddenly sees that Valentine has transformed into Peter. This scares Ender, and he immediately leaves the game. That night, Graf complains to Gwen about Peter being in the game. However, Gwen says she has no control over it because the game's content is created by Ender's thoughts. As Gwen says that Ender might be under pressure, Graf tells her to erase the game. Following this, he summons Ender to his office and commends his recent training results. He also says he'll be assigning Ender a team of his own. Ender looks shocked. but Graf says he believes the young cadet is ready to be a commander.
How'd you like to lead your own army?
Later that day, Ender meets his team members, which include Eli, Bean, Bernard, and some other kids. As he speaks to them for the first time, he says he'd like them to share their ideas with him whenever they have one that is better than whatever he comes up with. Just then, Bernard asks why Ender selected him to be part of his team, but the new commander says he didn't. However, he mentions that he believes Bernard can help the team. Days later, Ender's team starts climbing the ranks, and Graf looks impressed. He also says it might be time for Ender to take on a more prominent role in the military, but Gwen thinks it's too early. However, Graf says the command base is already waiting for feedback on Ender's development. Shortly after, he instructs one of his soldiers to set up another battle for Ender's team.
Tomorrow's game will commence at 0300.
The next day, Ender gets an alert that he'll be facing both Bonzo's team and the Leopards. He looks surprised because his team is facing their biggest rivals on such short notice and with his team already stressed. Despite this, he wakes his team and tells them to get ready. However, 2 of his soldiers get injured, so Ender tells them to stay back while the others go on. Before they enter the battle room, Petra and another soldier from Bonzo's team named Dink arrive at the entrance, saying they've been assigned to join Ender's team. Just then, Ender devises a strategy to find out where their opponents are hiding. As he eventually finds this, he leads his team out, and with a perfect strategy, he wins the battle, leaving Bonzo angry because his streak has ended. Later that day, while Ender is taking a shower, Bonzo enters with 2 of his teammates. Ender immediately tells him that he wants no trouble, but Bonzo says he doesn't care. As Bonzo then attacks him, Ender kicks him back. Unfortunately, Bonzo's head lands badly on the floor, and he passes out, leaving Ender worried. While he's then watching Bonzo get treated, Petra tells Ender not to blame himself because he didn't start the fight. However, he looks angry at himself as he believes he's slowly becoming as violent as Peter. Shortly after, Gwen also shows up to convince him that it's not his fault, but Graf interrupts her and says he wants to speak to Ender alone. When Gwen and Petra leave, Ender asks if Bonzo will die, but the Colonel says he won't. He also says Bonzo will be taken back to Earth soon. Ender says he'd love to follow him, but Graf doesn't approve of this. Just then, Ender says he'll resign if he's not allowed to return to Earth or speak to his sister. Despite this, Graf says he won't allow himself to be threatened.
Don't threaten me, boy.
After he returns to his office, Gwen also quits, and he accepts her resignation. The next day, Graf brings Ender to Earth so he can speak to Valentine. When they meet, Ender looks happy to see his sister. He also tells her how he now sees himself as someone who destroys things like Peter. However, Valentine tells him not to blame himself for what happened to Bonzo. As Ender says he wants to quit, Valentine says she thinks it's because he's scared he might fail to win against the Formics. He doesn't disagree, and Valentine then encourages him to return to space with Graf. Ender finally agrees. But as they leave, Graf tells him that they're now going to the Advanced Command Base, which is on the Formics territory. When they get there, Ender asks why the Formics need to be wiped out since they're not currently posing any threat, and Graf says it's to prevent a future attack. Following this, Ender is taken to his quarters to spend the night. The next morning, he sees a strange man in his room who attacks him. However, Ender refuses to fight back
Okay, you win.
because he doesn't want to do something he might regret. The man then tells him that he needs to be ready to fight at any time. Ender finally asks who he is, and he says he's Mazer. Ender looks shocked because he thought Mazer was dead, but he says he has been alive for a while.
You thought I was dead?
Later that day, Mazer shows Ender how he saved himself before crashing his plane into one of the enemy ships. Ender then asks how he knew the ship to crash into, and he says he noticed that their queen was inside that one. He also explains that he had to do it because the Formics can't think without their queen. He eventually mentions that he had to lie about his death because he wasn't sure he killed the queen. As he mentions that the Formics are rebuilding, Ender says it means they have more than one queen.
Right there.
Ender then asks if Mazer has found a queen since they invaded the alien territory, but he says he hasn't. Ender also asks why the Formics came to Earth, and Mazer says it was for water. After a while, Mazer takes Ender to meet Alai, Bean, Petra, Dink, and Bernard, who will all be his sub-commanders as he leads the invasion fleet. Mazer then shows them the simulation they'll use to practice their attack on the Formics. He also tells Ender that Petra will be in control of a killer device that will be used to wipe out the Formics on his command as long as there's a clear shot. Over the next few days, Ender and his team win the battles on the simulations, but as they face a tough one, they fail the mission. Mazer doesn't like this, and he lashes out at Ender for not delegating some roles to his team instead of doing it himself. Ender tries to defend his actions, but
Start over!
Sir, I can't win if I don't take any risks.
Mazer says there's no time for him to make mistakes during the war. As he also mentions that he has trained others in the past who failed, Ender realizes that he's not the first person to be called to lead a mission. However, Mazer and Graf tell him that he'll be the last one because there's no time to train someone else. Graf then tells Ender that he will lead his team for the final simulation the next day, after which he'll be deemed ready for the real battle. Later that night, Graf and Mazer look worried about Ender's readiness for the mission. While Mazer believes that Ender isn't ready, Graf says he's ready enough.
You go when you're ready enough.
Elsewhere, Ender also starts having doubts about the mission because he doesn't understand why the Formics have remained boxed in for so long without trying to invade Earth again. He tells Petra that they might be trying to communicate something, but she says it's impossible because the Formics can't talk. Even though Ender believes there are other ways to communicate, Petra tells him to stop thinking about it. The next day, when Ender and his team are ready for the final simulation, Graf introduces them to some senior military officers who will be confirming their position as commanders if they complete the final mission. After a while, Ender comes up with a new, shocking strategy that will see him sacrifice some of his soldiers so that they can destroy the Formics planet. This shocks everyone, but his team still goes through with it despite how dangerous it is. Shortly after, Ender then instructs Petra to take the shot, which wipes out the alien planet. This makes them happy as they've successfully completed their final simulation. However, Ender suddenly sees Mazer and the other officers discussing something. As they're through, they congratulate Ender on a successful mission. He still looks confused, but as he checks the images very well, Ender realizes that they've just wiped out the real planet. Ender cannot believe this, but Mazer and Graf still call him a hero.
Absolutely brilliant.
He doesn't accept the tag, and he accuses them of lying to him. He also mentions that he can't believe he sacrificed real soldiers in the battle, but Graf says that winning is what really matters. Ender still looks terrified, and he says the Formics probably didn't mean any harm to Earth. As he's then about to walk away, Graf gets him sedated and taken to his room. Petra asks to stay with him, and Graf allows this while the other team members walk away, still in disbelief that they've wiped out an entire species of aliens. While Ender is sleeping, he has a dream where he sees the creature from his game. As he seems to be having a nightmare, he suddenly wakes up and runs out of the room, saying he knows what the creature in the game wants. Petra follows him as he goes outside, and as she asks what's going on, he says the Formics have been trying to communicate with him through his game. He then mentions that he needs to go to the place he saw in his dream. Petra tries to stop him, but he says he'll be fine.
I have to do this.
Just then, he walks into the cave and sees the creature from his game that transformed into Valentine. She initially tries to hurt him, but as she sees that he feels sorry for what he did, she leaves him alone. As Ender then looks at her, he notices that she's dying. This hurts him, and he sheds a tear as he promises to find a new home for her and her remaining people.
I'll find a new home.
Days later, Ender sends Valentine a letter informing her that he's now an admiral. However, he also adds that he's still on a mission to keep his promise and find an uninhabited planet for the Formics and their queen.